Chapter 11. The Journey North. King Fred's spirits rose higher and higher as he rode out of Shoeville and into the countryside. Word of the king's sudden expedition to find the Ichabod had spread to the farmers who worked the rolling green fields, and they ran with their families to cheer the king, the two lords, and the royal guard as they passed. Not having had any lunch, the king decided to stop in Kurdsburg to eat a late dinner. "We'll rough it here, chaps, like the soldiers we are," he said to his party as they entered the city, "and we'll set out again at first light." But of course, there was no question of the king roughing it. Visitors at Kurdsburg's finest inn were thrown out onto the street to make way for him, and the king slept in a brass bed with a duck-down mattress after a hearty meal of toasted cheese and chocolate fondue. Spittleworth and Flapoon, however, were forced to spend the night in a little room over the stables. Both of them were a bit sore after a long day on horseback, and you may wonder why that was, because really they used to go hunting 5 times a week, but actually they would only ever hunt for a short time and then hide behind a tree and eat sandwiches and drink wine till it was time to go back to the palace. Neither of them was used to being on a horse, and Spittleworth's bony bottom was already starting to blister. Early the following morning, the king was brought word by Major Beamish that the citizens of Baronstown were very upset that the king had chosen to sleep in Kurdsburg rather than their splendid city. So, not to offend them, King Fred instructed his party to ride in an enormous circle through the surrounding fields. She and the farmers cheered them all the way. That way they ended up in Baronstown by nightfall. The delicious smell of sizzling sausages greeted the royal party, and a delighted crowd, carrying torches, escorted Fred to the best room in the city. There he was served roasted ox and honey ham, and he slept in a carved oak bed with a goose-down mattress. But Spittleworth and Flapoon had to share a tiny attic room, usually occupied by 2 maids. By now, Spittleworth's bottom was extremely painful, and he was furious that he'd been forced to ride 40 miles in a circle just to keep the sausage makers happy. Flapoon, who'd eaten far too much cheese in Kurdsburg and had consumed 3 beefsteaks in Baronstown, was awake all night, groaning with indigestion. Next day, the king and his men set off again, and this time they headed north, soon passing through vineyards from which eager grape pickers emerged to wave cornucopian flags and receive waves from the jubilant king. Spittleworth was almost crying from the pain of his poor bottom, even though he was sitting on a cushion, and Flapoon's belches and moans could be heard even over the clatter of hooves and the jingle of bridles. When they arrived at Jeroboam, they were greeted by trumpets, and the entire city was singing the national anthem. Fred feasted on sparkling wine and truffles before retiring to a silken 4-poster bed with a swan's-down mattress. But Spittleworth and Flapoon were forced to share a room over the inn's kitchen with a pair of soldiers, and everybody was busy partying, and they didn't get any sleep at all. At dawn the next morning, the king and his party set off for the marshlands after a famous farewell from the citizens of Jeroboam. Once they'd dusted Spittleworth off, they'd got the cushion on his bottom, Fred had stopped laughing, off they went. Soon they'd left Jeroboam behind, and they could hear only birdsong. For the first time in their entire journey, the sides of the road were empty. Gradually the lush green land gave way to thin, dry grass, crooked trees and boulders. "Extraordinary place, isn't it?" the cheerful king shouted back to Spittleworth and Flapoon. "I'm jolly glad to see these marshlands at last, aren't you?" The 2 lords agreed, but once Fred had turned round to face the front, they made rude gestures and they mouthed even ruder names at the back of his head. At last, the royal party came across a few people, and how the marshlanders stared. They fell to their knees like the shepherd in the throne room, and they quite forgot to cheer or clap, but they gaped as though they'd never seen anything like the king and the royal guard before. "Simple people, but touching, aren't they?" the king called gaily to his men as some ragged children gasped at the magnificent horses. "And where are we supposed to stay tonight?" Flapoon muttered to Spittleworth, eyeing the tumble-down stone cottages. "There's nowhere here." "Well, at least that's one comfort," said Spittleworth. "He'll have to rough it like the rest of us, and we'll see how much he likes it." They rode on through the afternoon, and at last, as the sun began to sink, they caught sight of the marsh where the Ichabod was supposed to live, a wide stretch of darkness studded with strange rock formations. "Your Majesty," called Major Beamish, "I suggest we set up camp now and explore the marsh in the morning. As your Majesty knows, the marsh can be treacherous. Fogs come suddenly here. We'd best be approaching it by daylight." "Nonsense," said Fred, who was bouncing up and down in his saddle like an excited schoolboy. "We can't stop now when it's in sight, Beamish." The king had given his order, so the party rode on until at last, when the moon had risen and was sliding in and out behind inky clouds, they reached the edge of the marsh. It was the eeriest place they'd ever seen. Wild, empty, desolate. A chilly breeze made the rushes whisper, but otherwise it was dead and silent. "As you see," said Lord Spittleworth after a while, "the ground is very boggy. Sheep and men would both be sucked under if they wandered out too far, and then the feeble-minded might take these giant rocks and boulders for monsters in the dark. The rustling of the weeds might even be taken for the hissing of some creature." "True, very true," said King Fred, but his eyes still roamed over the marsh as though he expected the Ichabod to pop up from behind a rock. "Shall we pitch camp then, sire?" asked Lord Flapoon, who'd saved some cold pies from Baronstown and was eager for his supper. "We can't expect to find an imaginary monster in the dark," pointed out Spittleworth. "True, true," repeated King Fred regretfully. Good gracious, how foggy it has become." And sure enough, as they'd stood looking out across the marsh, a thick white fog had rolled over them so swiftly, so silently, that none of them had noticed it.